second of the 4 webinar series on the occasion of 53rd Bank Nationalization Day 2021. Now we all know that this present government at the center, as a part of its wholesale privatization policy of the public sector enterprises, has announced privatization of the nationalized bank and insurance sector. Now, after the announcement came in the budget session, we have observed 2 days countrywide strike on 15th and 16th March this year. And it was supposed that we will continue our agitational program to the common masses as well our customers, but it could not do so because of the second wave that has hit the country from the month of April onwards. Till now, there are several restrictions in force in different parts of the country. And it is still very difficult, not impossible also, to meet physically and take out some program on the roads, as because in different states, in different places, permissions are not being granted to assemble or usage of microphone in the public assembly. So it is proving to be a handicap to us. In the year 2020 also, we could not observe this Bank Nationalization Day befittingly. But after the announcement in the budget session, it has become much more relevant to observe this day for the employees as well as for the common citizen of the country. Now we all know that after February, the government is not sitting idle. The media is very active, controlled by the corporate sector, to create apprehensions among the section of public as well as bank employees. We have already observed in the media that the Niti Aayog, the think tank of the present government, they were interested of suggesting names for probable privatization of the existing 12 public sector banks. And as per the reports, they have already submitted their proposal to the group of secretaries formed for this purpose. So government is not sitting idle. And it is also imperative in our part not to go by speculation which banks are going to be privatized. That's because from the day one, we have been commenting that it is not only 2, 3, or 4 banks that are target of the government. The government ultimately will try to privatize all the public sector banks. And theoretically, it has come true that a few days ago, none other than the Finance Secretary, Mr. T.V. Somanathan, he has told that most of the public sector banks eventually will be privatized. And the government is actively working on this. Now, so far as these differences between the banks in regard to the balance sheets and books of accounts, the government is trying very seriously to clean the balance sheets of the banks. Very recently, it has set up National Asset Reconstruction Company Limited, that is NARCL, which has been termed as bad bank. In the near future, this entity will eventually take care of the legacy of non-performing assets with over rupees 2 lakh crore primarily. And this NARCL has already been registered in the Register of Companies in Mumbai on 7th of this month. Now it has 8 public sector banks in its shareholders, whose share capital will be rupees 100 crore. And some private sector banks are also expected to pick up equity in this company. As the mechanism for transfer of stressed assets to ARCs has already in place, this NARCL is expected to start its functioning very soon. Now, while the government is not having any equity in this company, will provide guarantee against loan losses, probable loan losses on the SR, that is security receipts issued by the NARCL will be 85% for transfer of stressed assets, and the rest 15% paid to the banks in cash. So once this will be put in place, so we consider that the balance sheets of all the banks will be there for taking over by the corporate sector. Banks are not vegetables. We know that overnight these banks cannot be sold, but we should not be complacent also. We have to put our resistance, particularly the media, continuously propagating against the public sector banks. And we think that apart from resisting this on the roads, we should be ideologically and literally strong enough about the belonging of the public sector banks, its role, and what exactly are the contemplation of the government. So for this, we decided for holding these webinars. And we are fortunate enough that today it will be addressed by none other than one of the outstanding economists of the country, Professor Ramakumar. I don't think that he requires any introduction. We all know about him. And today's webinar will be coordinated by Comrade Pradeep Biswas, Vice President, as well as former General Secretary of our Federation. So I request Comrade Pradeep Biswas to take over the coordination of this webinar. Over to Comrade Pradeep Biswas. Thank you, comrades.
Welcome everybody. As told by our General Secretary, Comrade Devashish Basu Chaudhary, the present scenario in brief and the dangers that are looming large on us. We from BEFI Center am I audible?
Yes.
We decided to organize a webinar series, and the subject we decided that say public sector banks for the country and its people. Now, for today's seminar, this is the second event of our seminar, series seminar. The speaker is, as told by Comrade Devashish, Professor R. Ramakumar, who doesn't require an introduction. He is a faculty member in Tata Institute of Social Science, and he is a former member of the Planning Board, Kerala State, and he is the author of many books. And Professor Ramakumar is one of those economists of our country who has taken a position firmly in defense of public sector banks and public sector industries altogether, taken altogether. And he is closely associated with the trade union and democratic movement of the country also, and particularly with our organization, Bank Employees Federation of India, Whenever we have requested him, we have approached him to extend his hands by way of participating in different events of our federation, or for that matter of our bank-wise national organizations. He has always extended his hands of cooperation towards us. So without taking much of your time, I would now request Comrade, I think that there is nothing wrong in terming Professor Ramakumar as Comrade, because he is closely associated with the trade union movement also, to present his deliberations. Initially, he will be speaking for about 40-45 minutes, and thereafter, the participants will have the scope to raise questions by posting their questions in the chat box. And Professor Ramakumar will take up the questions and explain whatever is needed to be explained. With this, I request Comrade Ramakumar to take the floor and present his views on the subject. Thank you. Professor Ramakumar.
Thank you, Comrade Pradeep Vishwas, Comrade Nandakumar, Comrade Debashish, Comrade Krishnan, and many others who are here today in the Zoom room for having invited me to give this talk at the eve of the Bank Nationalization Day. I have always maintained that organizations like BEFI have been in the forefront of not just protecting public sector banks or public sector enterprises in India, but they've also played a stellar role in fighting for the very stability of the Indian economy itself, because public banks are the backbone of the economy, and we all know the role that public banks have played in building the economic foundations of our country. And so allow me to begin by saluting the great legacy of the bank employee unions, particularly BEFI, in what they are doing. Comrades, we are in a very specific era of public policy. If we look at the nature of the ruling dispensation that is holding power at the center in Delhi, who are they? These are the very same people, and that's where they differ from other other sections of the ruling class in India. These are the very sections of the Indian polity which actively opposed, not just indifferent or anything. They were people who actively opposed the bank nationalization of 1969. Who were those people opposing the nationalization of banks in 1969? We could see that there are broadly two sections which were opposing or actively ideologically opposed to the agenda of nationalization in India. One was a section of the Swatantra Party, which was anyway a party of the economic right wing. Leaders like Minu Masani took a very strong position opposing the nationalization of banks in 1969. The second section that actively opposed nationalization was the Bharatiya Janasangh, the predecessor of Bharatiya Janata Party prior to 1980, which is now ruling the government of India with a brute majority. Balraj Madhok of the Bharatiya Janasangh and Minu Masani of the Swatantra Party both approached the Supreme Court of India and asked the Supreme Court of India to declare nationalization of banks as unconstitutional. And who was Balraj Madhok's protege in the Bharatiya Janasangh of that time? His name was Atal Bihari Vajpayee, who later became the Prime Minister of India. Atal Bihari Vajpayee was an MP at that time, and he gave a long speech in the Lok Sabha at that time opposing why arguing why bank nationalization was actually a bad idea, was wrong, unconstitutional. The Supreme Court, of course, rejected the petition by these two people. But the history is out there in front of us, which says that the Bharatiya Janasangh, the Bharatiya Janata Party, that section of India's polity is a section which has actively opposed bank nationalization in 1969. They cannot escape that allegation at any point of time in history. Just like that section betrayed the Indian freedom struggle from Savarkar downwards. This was a section which actively played an anti-national role in economic policy making in India by opposing bank nationalization. These are the true anti-nationals of our country, but they call others anti-nationals. They put them in jail for sedition. They deny even a sipper for an 84-year-old Jesuit priest and end up killing him. This is the nature of change which has happened in Indian politics over the years. They were a minority in the opposition then. They have a brute majority on the ruling side today. And it is no surprise that these are the people now pushing the agenda of bank privatization with much more vigor than other ruling dispensations. What were they defending in 1969? What kind of banking system were these people defending in 1969? This was an anarchic, anti-people banking system that existed. A banking system for the elite, which existed prior to 1969. If you see India's banking system from about 1950 to 1965 or 67, you will see that large number of private banks were closing down. In fact, more than 500 private banks are supposed to have closed down. And a lot of people have lost their money, hard-earned savings, as a result of this closing down of more than 500 banks, private banks, between 1950 and 1967. If you take a simple ratio, bank deposit to GDP ratio, what is the total bank deposit in the country divided by GDP? If you see, that ratio was sharply falling between 1950 and 1967. Banks were concentrated in just 5 states. More than 75% of the bank branches were located in just 5 states of India. There was a very sharp rural-urban divide. More than 80% of the branches were located in urban and metropolitan areas. Rural areas were completely disregarded. 87% of the loans given by banks were for industry and commerce. If about 3,500 crore rupees was the total loans given in a year by banks, agriculture received only 20 crore. 20 crore out of rupees 3,500 crore. That's what agricultural credit was prior to 1969. This apart, there is one more important feature of banking at that time. Policy allowed cross ownership between industry and the banking system. More than 150 people sat in the board of directors of both industries on the one hand and banks on the other hand. There was enormous pilferage of loans from private sector banks to those industries which shared the board of directors with the banks. You pat my back, I pat your back. Crores of money were siphoned off into private industrial groups because of this kind of banking system that existed. Most of the money was never given back. And that's the reason why large numbers of private banks collapsed. More than 500 banks collapsed at that time. So the banking system of the pre-1969 era was completely anarchic, corrupt. It was a banking system for the elite class of this country. That's why we call it class banking. And that is the kind of a banking system that the Bharatiya Janasangh and the Swatantra Party were actually defending. We can see how anti-people these guys are. Their politics is. But then bank nationalization happened. Supreme Court upheld it. And then the whole history of bank nationalization is right in front of us, which tells us a kind of banking expansion which has never been seen in any developing country comparable to India, anywhere in the world. Bank nationalization was an economic miracle in the Indian economy. Take one or two simple numbers to look at it. Total number of rural bank branches. You had only 1,700 rural bank branches in 1969. By 1991, 1,800 had become 35,000. 35,000 rural bank branches were there in India by 1991. It was not just branches that were opened. There was a system of priority sector lending that was started, whereby 40% of the net bank credit had to be given to priority sectors, of which 18% was agriculture. So agricultural credit, rural credit expanded exponentially during this period. Not just farmers, sections of the scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, weaker sections, later women, later minorities, all of them started receiving credit, which was completely denied to them prior to 1969. It was an extension of democracy itself into new areas. We talk about financial inclusion today, but people forget that the biggest financial inclusion program in the whole world was in 1969, bank nationalization. People sometimes forget it. They think that opening some bank accounts in some areas of the country becomes financial inclusion. That's only a small part of financial inclusion. The real financial inclusion was taking banks to the rural areas. It contributed significantly to Green Revolution in India, which gave rise to food security in India. Without bank nationalization, there would have been no Green Revolution in India. It's a fact. There was a differential interest rate scheme, which gave loans to agriculture at lower interest rates compared to industry, which also benefited agriculture immensely. As a result, if one rural household had a debt outstanding of 100 rupees in 1962, only 17 rupees out of that 100 rupees came from the formal banking system in 1962. But by 1992, that 17 rupees in 100 rupees had become 64 rupees in 100 rupees. By 1992, 64 rupees out of 100 rupees in the debt portfolio of rural households in India was contributed by public banks and cooperatives, of course, together. This is the kind of change it brought about into the living conditions of people, working conditions of people in the countryside. Banks also contributed significantly to what we call as financial intermediation. The very purpose of banks is mopping up the surplus liquidity in the different areas of the country, aggregating them in one place and making them available for investment for others. This is what we call as financial intermediation. Due to financial intermediation, there was enormous rise in savings rate in India, enormous rise in investment rates in India, enormous rise in bank deposit to GDP ratio in India. All these contributed immensely to economic growth in India. If you ask the two important features at a theoretical level underlying bank nationalization in India, I will say there are two. One is the active use of monetary policy to further the agenda of redistribution in the society. Monetary policy was used actively here. Banks went to rural areas, pushed credit into rural households. So monetary policy was actively used to further redistribution. Second is India's bank nationalization is a classic example of why what some neoclassical economists say as financial repression. That is, if you administer interest rates, it will lead to a fall of savings rate, fall of investment rates, etc. And so interest rates should be completely deregulated. That's the argument of many neoclassical economists. India's nationalization agenda proved that theory completely wrong. Here was a system which administered interest rate across the board and yet raised savings rate, investment rate, bank deposit to GDP ratio, etc. Enormous financial intermediation grew in this area, in this period. So these were the two important features. But when liberalization of the economy came in 1991, financial liberalization came, Narasimhan Committee gave its report, etc. What is ironic is that these two very positive features of bank nationalization were actually held against it. The Narasimhan Committee argued that monetary policy or the banking system should no more be used to further the agenda of redistribution in the society. That role, it said, it does not belong to monetary policy. That role belongs to fiscal policy. If you want to pursue redistribution in the society, you should do it through the budgets of the governments, fiscal policy, not through monetary policy. What is the role of monetary policy? Inflation targeting. That's all. That's one feature. Second is the proponents of financial liberalization said nationalization promoted financial repression. It was a lie. It was complete wrong. Bank nationalization had actually done the opposite. It had raised savings rate, raised investment rates, raised bank deposit to GDP ratio, etc. But it was again ironic that the agenda of the accusation of financial repression was posed against the nationalization of banks in India. If these two ironies are out there, there was a third point: universal banking. There is no more difference between short-term lending institutions and long-term lending institutions. It's time to merge them. That means the very agenda of long-term infrastructural developmental finance came to be a dead horse by the time of financial liberalization. Organizations like the IDBI and all are casualties of this kind of a policy. Everybody gives long-term infrastructure finance. There are no specialized developmental financial institutions for that purpose as existed in the past. The fourth point was public banks are inefficient. Public banks are not good in corporate governance. But private banks are good in corporate governance. They are more amenable to prudential regulations. They are more efficient. So we need to introduce new private sector banks, also privatize existing public sector banks. So in essence, the complete taking away of monetary policy from the agenda of redistribution, the argument of financial repression, the argument that universal banking is a better option than specialized institutions for long-term developmental finance, and the exalted status in terms of efficiency and corporate governance given to private sector banking system were features of financial liberalization of the 1991 and after. What happened in this period? Banking became focused more on commercial modes of operation. Earlier, there was social and developmental banking. Now there is only commercial banking. Banks are no more interested in social purposes, developmental purposes. Banks are only interested in profits. Not just private sector banks, where it is obvious, but even public sector banks should focus on the bottom line, the balance sheet, rather than whether they are serving any social purpose or not. You can serve social purposes, no problem. But that activity should also be profitable. Only then can banks undertake it. If there is less profit or loss coming out of it, don't get into it. Ignore that area. Oh, there will be inequality, there will be problems of poverty, etc. No, that's not the job of monetary policy. Let fiscal policy take care of it. Banks can withdraw from it. This was the agenda. This was the spirit that the financial liberalization agenda pushed for banking in this country. Privatization began in the 90s itself. In 1993, in the first round of privatization that happened, you saw that 10 licenses were given. Only 9 of them were formed, but 9 banks were formed, but 10 licenses were given in 1993. Global Trust Bank was one of those 9. ICICI Bank was one of those 9. Second round began in 2001, where large numbers of NBFCs were converted into banks. Kotak Mahindra Bank was one of them. Yes Bank was one of them. Then came the third round by around 2015, where you did this dangerous change of allowing industrial groups to own shares in banks, in private banks. It was actually a return to the pre-1969 policy of allowing industrial sector to actually own banks also, though with some conditions. So IDFC Bank came, Bandhan Bank came, all these banks are products of that era. But the point is this: private sector banks were pushed, arguing that they have better corporate governance than public sector banks. They are not as corrupt like public sector banks. This was the argument. What do we see around us? Has any public sector bank failed in the era of financial liberalization? Not one. Not one. But have private sector banks failed in the era of financial liberalization? Oh, we can't even start counting on it. 38 private banks have been shut down or merged with some other bank in the era of financial liberalization. 38. Take each of these big examples that are given from the first phase of privatization, second phase of privatization, etc. Take the Global Trust Bank of 1993. What happened to the Global Trust Bank? In 2001, it gave a loan of rupees 4,000 crore to a gambler called Ketan Parikh, who ran away with the money, invested in the stock market and lost all of it. That was a Ketan Parikh scam of 2001. If the corporate governance is very good, then the balance sheet of GTB Bank, Global Trust Bank, in 2001 and 2002 should have actually shown negative net worth. But because they had wonderful auditors, negative net worth was shown as positive net worth in their balance sheets. And when was this detected? RBI went for a checking in 2003 and 2004. All the positive net worth was replaced with negative net worth. The bank failed. Oriental Bank of Commerce had to come in and take over the Global Trust Bank and all its losses. 4,000 crore is the essential loss of Oriental Bank of Commerce when it took over Global Trust Bank. Whose money is this 4,000 crore? People's money. People's money has been spent to take over the losses of a private sector bank. Where is corporate governance here? Where is clean governance here? Take, for example, the ICICI Bank, again, a candidate of the first phase of privatization. Where is its managing director today? Out on bail. What is the case there? This managing director, her husband had a company. They had a deal with Venugopal Dut of Videocon, where Dut was asked to invest rupees 64 crore into the company of the managing director's husband. And in return, ICICI Bank gave rupees 1,825 crore as a free loan to Venugopal Dut's company. This MD is in jail, out on bail now. Where is corporate governance? What was the board of directors doing when the 1,825 crore loan was being given? Take, for example, Yes Bank, the latest in the saga of private bank failures. Here, you had extraordinary high levels of exposure to vulnerable sectors or accumulated over many years. There was malpractice. There was fraud to benefit friends, your own shell companies, etc. So payments were made to Yes Bank controlled shell companies on the one hand, and loans were given freely to real estate companies like DHFL, which led to high levels of losses for Yes Bank. Now State Bank of India has to take over Yes Bank. And what is the total cost that SBI will have to incur while absorbing the losses of Yes Bank into its own system? Rupees 10,000 crore. Rupees 10,000 crore is the essential loss of State Bank of India when it takes over Yes Bank. Whose money is this 10,000 crore? People's money, taxpayers' money, depositors' money, savers' money. They're all being used to absorb private sector losses. So here there is privatization of profits and nationalization of the losses. If there are profits, they are privatized. If there are losses, they're socialized. People, it's on the people. Losses are on people. Profits are for individuals. This is the ideology of financial liberalization. It has made a sham of corporate governance. It has made a sham of the concept of clean governance, corporate, the governing body oversight, and so on. So these scams and failures, the 2 points about each of these scams and failures, each of these scams has made our financial system much more fragile. Number two, each of these scams, wherever these private sector banks were taken over by public sector banks, has actually increased the burden of public sector banks. They have mounted losses of public sector banks, which have taken over them. This is the history of private banks during the era of financial liberalization. But what are public sector banks doing in this time? Look at the majestic role that they played in the same period that 38 private sector banks failed in the country. I'll give you only 2 or 3 examples. Look at the kind of role that public sector banks played during the 2007 global financial crisis. Banks and financial institutions across the world were failing, collapsing. But the Indian banking system stood up strong. It did not collapse. There were 1 or 2 failures, but it did not collapse like in other countries. That was primarily because Indian banking system was continuing to be dominated by public sector banks. If public sector banks were not there, Indian banking system would have collapsed like a house of cards. Indian economy would have been finished by that kind of a collapse. It wouldn't have been able to manage the collapse. That's the most important role that public sector banks played in 2007 and 8. Then when the agenda of financial inclusion was pushed, who played the most important role in opening BSBDA accounts across the country? Public sector banks. When agricultural credit was doubled, who took the initiative in giving more agricultural credit? Public sector banks. When Jan Dhan scheme was introduced, who took the initiative in opening more than 60 to 70% of the Jan Dhan accounts? Public sector banks. Similarly, when Mudra scheme came, who took the initiative in giving more MSME loans? Public sector banks. So whenever you have an initiative or a scheme or a project of national importance, you want the public sector banks to play a very important role. And remember, these are not activities which make significant profits. The profits from these activities is relatively less compared to the kind of credit that credit activities, banking activities that private sector bank engage themselves in. But yet they have been asked to take over. They are happily taken over those activities, including during demonetization of 2016. We saw the role played by public sector banks. Private sector banks, on the other hand, were exempted from any of these burdens. They did not have to meet priority sector targets of 40% for a very long time. There was no requirement for them to open X number of rural bank branches in any year. There was no such necessity for them. Well, public sector banks had to necessarily open rural bank branches of a particular number every year in the unbanked areas. So all kinds of incentives and exemptions were provided to the private sector, which played a very insignificant role in many of these schemes of national importance, while public sector banks were forced to take up most of these burdens where profits were lower. Take the COVID-19 crisis. Take the moratoriums that were provided by the banking system. Take, for example, the MSME loan moratorium. Who has taken the most taken up the burden of MSME moratoriums in this country? It is urban cooperative banks and public sector banks. The burden is on them, not for private sector banks. Now, leave MSME moratorium, take all moratoriums together, agriculture, vehicles, home, everything, take everything together. You will see that 44% of the credit outstanding of public sector banks come under the ambit of moratoriums, while only 34% of the credit outstanding of private sector banks come under the ambit of moratoriums. This is the situation. All loss-making or less profitable activities are heaped on the public sector banks, and private sector banks are given a free play, a free run. No social responsibility at all. You can function completely on a profitable commercial basis. If you walk into a scam, if there is corruption in your management, don't worry. Public sector banks will absorb that loss. Are you making profit? Or you can keep it. I will even reduce the corporate tax for you from 40% to 25%. This is the perverse banking policy, or rather larger economic policy that we have been following in this country for the last 25 to 30 years. After all this, you say that, oh, you are burdened with enormous amount of NPAs, and that is why we have to privatize you. Where did the NPAs come from? Did they fall from the heaven? No. Higher NPAs of public sector banks are the result of public policy in this country. They are policy induced. They are because of a certain kind of government policy. What are they? First is you killed long-term development finance in this country. By killing long-term development finance in this country and converting all banks into kind of universal banks, you ask the public sector banks to lend to long-term projects, whereas your liabilities, that is deposits, were short-term in nature. So here's a banking system where most of the deposits are short-term in nature, but their lending is long-term in nature. It's a recipe for failure, or at least a crisis. Second, whenever economic problems arose, whenever economic crisis came, where fiscal policy should have taken up the role of spending more and taking the economy out of the crisis, you had instituted the Fiscal Responsibility and Budgetary Management Act, FRBM Act, where your fiscal deficit cannot rise more than 3%. As a result, you will say, no, fiscal policy cannot intervene in this regard because our fiscal deficits will rise, foreign capital will be displaced, and hence we are going to ask banks to take over that burden as a substitute for fiscal policy. And instead of government spending out of either taxes or borrowal, we will ask banks to lend more and more to certain sectors. Here again, you're burdening banks with a responsibility which the government, through its budgets and fiscal policy, should have undertaken. But the neoliberal economic policy has been such that it has substituted monetary policy, fiscal policy with monetary policy. So basically, these two, that is the pushing of public sector banks into giving long-term infrastructure loans and substituting fiscal policy with monetary policy. Both these were the primary reasons for the rising trends of NPAs in this country. Of course, economic conditions were bad. Some projects failed and all that. We know that. But the existence of a robust long-term infrastructure system would have actually handled the crisis or economic slowdown much better than public sector banks who do not have the capacity, who do not have the expertise in judging which is a good, better long-term infrastructure projects and which is not. That's a job of long-term infrastructure companies, infrastructure lending companies. Now they are bringing back a DFI. In the last budget, you saw that development financial institution is being formed. Why did you destroy it as part of financial liberalization? You destroyed long-term infrastructure lending companies in the country. For 30 years, you did it. You pushed the public banking system into crisis through NPAs and so on. And now you suddenly realize that we need a long-term developmental financial institution. We are going to form a DFI. Financial liberalization thus was a Tughlaqian policy, we can say. You're agreeing that all you did was wrong and you're going back to the formation of a DFI. But what is happening to our existing banking system? What happened to the trouble and losses that you have caused to it through your misinformed policies? What about the agenda of recapitalization? No, we don't have money for recapitalization. Even when they did recapitalization, all recapitalization was attempted outside the budgets so that the space could be preserved for future privatization of these banks, which were supposed to have been recapitalized. You're basically preparing the ground for future privatization through all these. Now you have a new idea called the bad bank. What does the bad bank do? The bad bank will basically absorb all the bad assets of the banking system and leave the banking system with only good assets. Why? Because only then you can sell them. Only then there will be buyers for those banks. So you basically absorb all these loans into a bad bank. That means it's on the head of the on the shoulders of the government and the taxpayer and the depositor, because most of that will be financed by the existing private public sector banks. And then you will leave the banks, the remaining part, that the good part of the assets of these banks, you will keep them separate, and then you will sell them off to private companies. This is the situation we have. Somebody is asking, what is the difference between monetary policy and fiscal policy? The difference is that monetary policy is that policy which you do outside the budget, through banking system, through the financial system. Loans from the banking system, for example. What are the interest rates in the economy, for example? What the RBI does, for example. All that comes under the purview of monetary policy. Fiscal policy means how much the government is spending from its budget. That is fiscal policy. What I said earlier was this spending from the government's budget was not preferred, and instead the government preferred banks to lend more. That was what I was trying to explain earlier. So basically, the bad bank idea is also another step towards future privatization of the banking system. So you can see a whole series of measures which promote the private banking system, while there is no evidence that these private banks actually function better than public sector banks, or are more stable than the private sector banks or public sector banks, or have better corporate governance than public sector banks, or are less corrupt than public sector banks. You don't have any evidence on any of these. Yet you give them a free run. As a result, what happened? Of the total lending of all banks in this country, public plus private plus foreign plus all the other banks, the share of private banks was only about 20% in about 2008 or 2009. 20%. Today, in 2019-20, the share of private banks in the total lending has gone up to 35%. From 19 to 20% to about 35%. Only 65% of the loans are given by other banks. This is the kind of privileging of private sector banking system that you have undertaken in this country. But given that public sector banks have taken up most of the burdens in this period of social and development banking ideas in this period, and they have also been burdened with NPAs in this period. What has happened? They are in losses. The total loss of public sector banks in the last year was minus 26,015 crore. 26,000 crore was the loss, net loss of public sector banks in 2019-20. But what is happening to private sector banks? They have a net profit of 19,000 crore. Take foreign banks, they have a net profit of 16,000 crore. This is the situation. You basically squeezed public sector banking in this country, and you're not recapitalizing them deliberately because you want to take away all their bad assets through a bad bank, keep the good part aside, and sell them off to your private crony capitalist. This is the phase of financial liberalization that we are living in. But what are you doing with the public sector banks on the other side? You're constantly telling them, do this, do that, do Jan Dhan, do agricultural credit, do rural banking, etc., etc. And you're also telling them, while you do that, constantly you have to generate profits also. So even public sector banks have been asked to concentrate on profits. They have done that. As a result, even public sector banks in the era of financial liberalization are withdrawing gradually from the objectives of social and developmental bank. They are forced to withdraw from rural areas, forced to withdraw from agricultural lending, etc. So if you see 1992 and 2013 as the benchmark, you will see if in 1992, 64% of the debt outstanding of rural households came from the formal sector. By 2013, that 64% had fallen to 56%. Only 17% or 19% was contributed to by money lenders in 1992. Today, 31% of the debt outstanding of rural households is contributed to by the money lender. So what is the bottom line of financial liberalization in rural areas? The return of the Mahajan, the return of the Sahukar, the return of the Shylocks of the rural areas. That is the bottom line of financial liberalization for the rural households of this country. The return of the money lender, withdrawal of public banking. That has gone hand in hand with the pursuit of profitability even in public sector banking system, under the larger rubric of financial liberalization ideology in this country. And now what is happening? Now, this government in the last 2 years, using the COVID-19 crisis, has been trying to pursue the agenda of privatization with much greater vigor. When country after country is trying to keep assets in the public sector, here you don't want to tax your capitalist. You don't want to reinstate your corporate tax at a higher level than it was in the past. You want to continue to give more and more incentives to your cronies. But you want money to spend for the government, and you want it through your disinvestment program, including selling away of banks in this country. That is a perversity of policy that you see today around us. So 10 public sector banks are to merge to just 4 private sector. 10 public sector banks are to merge and become just 4 private public sector banks from last year and this year. The new agenda is to ensure that Bank of Maharashtra, Central Bank of India, Indian Overseas Bank, and Bank of India are privatized this year. So at a time when our economic growth is going down to negative levels, where you need more and more public sector banks to play an active role in financial intermediation in this country, you're doing exactly the opposite of what an intelligent policy should do. This government does not listen to any intelligent person. The most important problem with this government, as many people have pointed out, is a very significant intellectual deficit. They do not listen to an economist. They do not even listen to right-wing economists. Because at least some right-wing economists are competent. They will tell you, no, don't go this far. They listen to only cronies. They listen to only yes men. Like only those who said, Hail Hitler, were considered as loyal men. Today, you know what the new slogan for loyalty is. The slogan has changed, but the times are the same. The times have great similarities. We have a rising tide of fascism in this country, and that's killing everything that is even remotely democratic. So intellectuals are it's just not that intellectuals are not listened to. Dissenting intellectuals are even put in jail for sedition, which is a British era law. That law was instituted in this country against Mahatma Gandhi. Today, the same law is being used against intellectuals, put them into jail. A Jesuit priest of 83 years old was put in jail, and he was institutionally murdered. Isn't it a fact in front of us? Every institution in this country is under sale. The Central Bureau of Investigation has become a Central Bureau of idiots. The Enforcement Directorate is being used for political purposes. The Customs is being used for political purposes. The National Investigative Agency, NIA, is used for political purposes. Even the Supreme Court of India is not fully free. As some of their retired Supreme Court judges themselves have said recently. You have a complete institutional breakdown in this country. And this is the context in which you also see in the financial sector a push for an anti-people agenda of privatization and a sort of sabotaging of the very agenda of social and developmental banking, which was very much a part of nationalization of banks in 1969. Remember, the ruling party of this country is the same ruling party which opposed nationalization in 1969. Let's not forget that. So it's no surprise that they're pursuing this policy. So the agenda of protecting public sector banks in this country is also an agenda to protect Indian economy, to protect Indian democracy itself. And that is the slogan based on which all of us, not just academics and trade unionists like you, but also the middle class of this country, the farmers of this country, the rural poor of this country, all have to hold hands together to protect an institutional framework which is so central to Indian economy and Indian democracy, which is public sector banks. Thank you very much, comrades.
Very educative and comprehensive presentation by Professor Ramakumar. Now it will be a question hour session. Now those who wants to put question, they can post their questions in the chat box. As of now, questions, some suggestions, okay, but Ramakumar will also deal with that. But in case any other comrade wants to put any question on the chat box, they are welcome. So now I would request Comrade Ramakumar to have a glance on the chat box and give his remarks. Over to Comrade Ramakumar.
Comrade, I am seeing these comments. There isn't a question here. Most of them are comments and statements with which I tend to agree. One of the points being made here is that a joint all India strike is essential, immediately consisting of bank, insurance, coal, rail, etc. All these organizations to give a message that we are going to be united to overthrow this regime. That's very much true. In fact, there is a broader slogan of save the public sector itself in various sectors, which has become necessary. As is correctly pointed out, it's not just in the banking sector, in the insurance sector, in the mining sector, in the railway sector, everywhere the agenda of privatization is being pursued with a much vigor. And this is where the employees' organizations in each of these sectors need to play a leading role in mobilizing public opinion against these policies. I have already explained while I was speaking the difference between monetary and fiscal policy. That was a personal direct message to me. Yes, Comrade Krishnan's comment is the lending policy of RBI says 10 to 20% of collateral security is sufficient for corporate lending. Is that not a reason for large corporate NPAs? Yes. See, this whole proliferation of NPAs is the result of the government policies themselves. The government for over the last 10 or 15 years has refused to undertake what we call as a counter-cyclical fiscal policy, where the economy is going down, the government comes in, spends more in the society, in the economy, puts more money into the pockets of people who will spend it, whereby more demand is generated and more economic growth and employment are further generated. This is the classic economic solution to the problem. But what has happened here is that the government has refused to spend. It says fiscal deficit will rise. So it basically burdened the whole responsibility on monetary policy or the banking system. And there you gave all kinds of exemptions. You relaxed all kinds of regulations to ensure that this lending to private sector, particularly in terms of long-term lending, goes on unregulated. And that is what has resulted in this NPAs of today. So this whole idea of NPA is actually policy induced. And that is why the government has the primary responsibility to set the system right. But the government is withdrawing from that responsibility, saying we are going to sell you off. I'll take all the bad loans to my side, that is, dump it on people, and then sell it. All the good assets will be sold off to the private people who are their cronies. That is the anti-people nature of the policy that is in front of us. I completely agree. This is also one reason why NPAs have grown. Chiranjeev Ghosh asks, after the bad assets of PSBs were transferred to NARCL, will it be very lucrative for domestic and foreign investors, making it easier to sell off the PSBs? That is the agenda. That is what they expect. That if you move out all these bad assets into this bad bank, then the rest of it will become lucrative for private investors to come, even foreign banks to come, buy up even industrial houses. That is the most dangerous part. You are now going to allow even industrial houses to own shares in public sector banks. This is something which even right-wing people, right, like Raghuram Rajan, for example, the former governor, they wrote, and Viral Acharya and all, they wrote articles against it. Even they were opposed to it. They're not left-wing people at all. They're right-wing economists, neoliberal economists. They gave enormous intellectual legitimacy to the agenda of financial liberalization. It is they who are arguing, don't do it. But the government is in no mood to listen to any such view. That is a real problem that we are seeing today. The latest IBC only has helped to loot and plunder public money legally. What is the alternative? See, the alternative is that there is no alternative but to absorb at least some of the losses in the public sector, because that's the this legacy of loss cannot be simply forgotten. Okay, the loss is right in front of you. You have to do something about that bad asset or the loss. So there has to be some way in which the public sector or the government will have to absorb at least part of the loss. But the problem here is that once you do that, then you should not go back to business as usual. You should not go back to private banking as the preferred alternative. It should also lead to a very clear, decisive turn in policy whereby public banks come back to prominence. The idea of privatization is disbanded. See, you cannot do both. You cannot absorb the loss and then asking them to continue the business as usual, because tomorrow you'll have to absorb another round of losses because they'll continue to speculate. So the policies, I'm very clear. Some part of the loss will, what is recapitalization? Recapitalization is mean government is spending money from its budget, which is taxpayers' money, to save banks. Or that is in some sense using public money to save banks. So that is also an absorption of loss, which has to be done. There's no other way. But the point is, what do you do after that? That is a question that I am trying to answer here by saying we should not be going back to the agenda of privatization once you finish that round of absorption of losses. That is a problem we see. But the government here is doing both. It's trying to shift all the bad assets on people and sell all the good assets to private players, which is a very problematic, dangerous policy. Pricing NBA is also because of blind following of Basel norms. See, that is there. The Basel norms are very much there. These are norms which are not necessarily applicable to the context of India, but they are being forced on it. In fact, even now, today, you're even asking cooperative banks to follow certain prudential regulations where they are not supposed to be organizations of that sort. So it's a very, you're using Basel 3, 4 norms, etc., in a very mechanical way. That's a big problem that we are having. They're not exactly causing NPAs, but they actually are a hindrance in dealing with crises. That is the problem that you see. How do we fight against this regime? Farmers are fighting more than 7 months with no change from the government. This is a question that the most senior trade union leaders who are sitting here, much more experienced than me, with decades of experience than me, are much better placed to answer. But I will just say one point here, which I always say, which is that the agenda of fighting bank privatization is not simply a sectarian trade union agenda. And I'm sure leadership of the organization is very much aware of that. It has to become a people's movement. So the battle has to be joined by common people, the middle class, farmers, workers. So it has to become a joint fight. So when farmers are fighting against the farm loss, the banking employees and their organizations should be standing next to them, saying, we are with you in this struggle. And that's just that they will be with you in your struggle. So it has to be we have to build a united platform of struggle of all the working people of this country to sort of address this immediate threat that we are facing of this onslaught of neoliberalism in this country. Farmers' struggle gives us a lot of lessons of great amount of commitment, conviction, right? The kind of perseverance that the farmers' movement has shown is actually a lesson to all people's movements in this country. That is something which is very remarkable about them. That's the way the fight should be taken forward, and I'm sure the leaders of the organization here will have more important things to say than me. Chinese public sector banks have been playing a pivotal role in the development of China. Yes, that's very true. More importantly, in China, developmental finance, long-term infrastructure lending is not simply a forgotten agenda. Right? It is a the most important way in which most of the Chinese infrastructural investments have been financed is through developmental finance. That's the most important point. Okay, so we cannot forget the role played by these financial institutions in Chinese development. What do you think about the specific role of trade unions? I've already said that. While we analyze NPAs of PSBs, willful default or otherwise, which is more? You people will know that more because you see these defaulters face to face on a daily basis compared to me. But you do see the Vijay Malias and Nirav Modis and Mehul Choksis of today. You also know that the kind of NPAs of Anil Ambani's company, what it is. You also know who are the top 10 or top 5 defaulters in this country. You people only put out the data, and people like me come to know of it only through your press statements and media releases. So whether it's willful or not, you know it. You know it is willful, isn't it? A large part of it is indeed willful because you think you know that you can simply escape from all responsibility of paying back that amount, and the governments actually actively sometimes collude with you to help you in that whole process, right? I have not mentioned about the recent attack of the central government on the cooperative sector. I have not, because that will become the topic of a completely new lecture. So I will not be able to do that here. But we know here again that the whole problem is that the reforms in the cooperative sector mirror those in the commercial banking sector, though in a different way. Cooperative banks are also being asked to perform on purely commercial basis, right, with profit considerations. So the many prudential regulations like CRAR of 9%, 12%, etc., are being forced upon them. The Vaidyanathan committee actively pushed that agenda. Then came the Prakash Bakshi committee, which said that PACS, primary agricultural cooperative societies, should be downgraded to being the banking correspondents of district cooperative banks and scheduled commercial banks. That is the second attack that came. Then came the Malegam committee. Then came what is it committee? It's some I'm forgetting the names of these chairpersons. A lot of other committees came. What is the agenda here? The agenda here is, over a period of time, the Reserve Bank of India wants, and the Government of India wants, urban cooperative banks in India to be transformed into small finance banks. Okay, small finance banks is what they want urban cooperative banks to become over a period of time. And that's one stage of killing of cooperatives that is already on track. The second is rural cooperatives. Rural cooperatives, PACS, as I said, they want them to downgrade them into the banking correspondents of scheduled commercial banks or district cooperative banks. So this is the broad agenda in the sector of cooperatives that has been there for a while. Now, over a period of time, this has also become constitutional an issue. That is, using the 97th Amendment of 2012, what the UPA government did was to try to encroach into the space of the state governments and to tell them you should pass this law, that law, etc., which is none of their business, because entry 32 in the state list of the constitution lists cooperatives as an exclusive state business, not even in the concurrent list. But this government, using the 97th Amendment, tried to encroach into the space, or not this government, the last UPA government did that. This government has been continuing that attack, but the Supreme Court has now stepped into it. It has, in a very important judgment, declared that the 97th Amendment is unconstitutional as far as it regards cooperative sector. And that's a very important victory in the resistance against the encroachment of union government into cooperative matters. But then, with the formation of the Ministry of Cooperatives, headed by none other than Amit Shah, the agenda is very clear. They are going to use the only other sector that is available to them, which is the multi-state cooperatives, and they may also use other large cooperatives under their control, like Amul and so on. They are trying to encroach into the space of different states and sort of extend their activities in a big way. That is a danger that is going to unfold in the next few months or years, against which we have to be very guarded politically as well as legally. That is something that is very important. It will be our responsibility in the near future. So that's the kind of, the cooperatives are under attack. There's no doubt about it. The other question here is to reduce lending rates, will it not affect the interests of depositors and pensioners? The whole agenda is to push people away from banks towards stock markets. Let's be very clear. The agenda is to reduce interest rates to the extent that people lose any incentive to deposit in the banks and actually will go into the stock market. The whole debate related to how much will the government insure the deposits of people in banks, of depositors in banks, all those debates are actually a precursor to the larger agenda of pushing people out of the banking system and pushing them into investing in speculative activities in the stock market. That is the larger point in front of us. So depositors, pensioners, all their money is going to be used for purely gambling purposes in the financial markets. That's the big danger of tomorrow if this agenda is pursued as it is now. Can you mention the experience of certain countries which face depression due to privatization, opening up of the banking sector? So many. Look at the Latin American countries. Look at many African countries where the little public banking that existed was killed over the last 30 to 40 years. There is no banking sector by any name in these areas. Right? So all these are classic examples of how people are pushed more and more into the hands of the non-institutional sources, stock markets, etc., which basically end up killing the financial basis of most rural households. So there are in many countries of Latin America and Africa, you do see this in the period of neoliberal reforms after the 1980s. Mexico is a classic example, for example, where which I can immediately think of. Okay. Auditors who are manipulating accounts of companies and financial institutions, how will they be held responsible and booked under law? There are laws already. There are laws. But the point is, those laws, there are loopholes in those laws which are being used to save these auditors. Because you saw, for example, what large auditors did for a long period of time, isn't it? So big auditing firms, credit rating firms, etc., are all complicit in this agenda of misclassification of accounts, of misrepresenting audit statements, etc., cover up for the negative net worth elements of your balance sheet, to present a rosy picture of just like you saw in Global Trust Bank, for example, a negative net worth was changed into a positive net worth by a set of interesting auditing groups. So that's something that we have seen, and very strict penalties and punishments should be given for any such. There should be blacklisting of such firms. Those facilities already exist. Those laws already exist. The question is whether we are putting them into place, putting them into action. Right? That's the question we are facing. Banks were not allowed to function from 2004. First opening of zero balance accounts, I mentioned that. Financial inclusion, demonetization, I mentioned that. GST, not much, but indirectly, yes. And merger, exactly. I agree with you, Comrade Kranti. Mr. Jagannath, BJP's legacy against bank nationalization is well known. Bank nationalization was during Congress regime, and setting up Narasimha committee was also during Congress regime. That is obvious. That is the criminal role played by the Congress party in financial liberalization. Simply cannot be forgotten. I was only saying BJP because they are ruling now. That's all. You're absolutely right, Comrade Jagannath. How to save public sector since we don't have political alternatives? Our focus must be towards a political alternative. Yes. In fact, saving banks should become the political slogan, the part of the common minimum program of a future government. Right? That's the kind of agenda that we should push. No doubt about it. whether we have to give the political call for defeat of corporate communal fascist rulers to safeguard all public sectors and people's life. Yes, absolutely. That's exactly what I said towards the end of my presentation. We all have to hold hands together and fight this oppressive fascistic regime that we have. Further, would like to point out that all financial institutions could be joined and fight against LPG policy. Better late than never. Yes, Kalayarasi's point is completely well taken, and I'm sure the leaders of the movement will take up and explain that much better than me. Even ordnance factories and armaments depots are being privatized. Strikes are going on in Visakhapatnam and West Bengal. In fact, we have even privatized space expeditions as part of your COVID-19 packages. That's the state we are in, right? We're not even we're not leaving things. We are moving to the next stage of privatization, right? Next will be privatization in Mars, right? That's the kind of future that we are moving towards. Can the government privatize PSBs overnight without giving any scope to fight? Haven't they done it? Have they merged public sector banks overnight with other banks? Have we been able to do much? So anything can happen. Can you explain the future of PSBs if the government is strictly following the merger and privatization? You'll have a declining, shrinking role for public sector banks in this country, which is going to adversely affect the very future of financial intermediation in this country. You already have a fall of savings rate, investment rate, etc. over the last 10 years, right? So it's out there in front of us. The weakening of public banks is going hand in hand with financial disintermediation. That's the reality of our country, right? On the 30th anniversary, Manmohan Singh has warned against a daunting road ahead. Manmohan Singh should actually apologize to the Indians for being the father of financial liberalization, and he should see what the disastrous impacts of his financial liberalization have been in the rural areas, on farmers, on agriculture, on public banking. And he should be one of the people who should now apologize to the nation and argue for undoing all the damages done by financial liberalization. But he is not in any such mood. He's actually asking us to be a little careful, but he's asking us to move forward nevertheless. So I don't see any big change here in the policies of, or difference in the policies of Congress government or BJP government. The additional point about BJP government is they are fascistic as well. Right? So you have a double whammy of a Hindutva nationalism on the one hand, plus corporate-led crony capitalism on the other side. Right? You have a combination of these two under the BJP. That's the single most important danger today. Please name some economies which are trying to keep assets in the public sector. China. Classic example is China. But even countries like Germany, for example, are not destroying their public banks in any form. For example, they have their long-term financial institution. They have kept it intact for lending for developmental purposes, long-term developmental purposes. So there are many countries, even today, which have not destroyed their banking sector through following some crony capitalist policies. So yeah, there are many examples that we have in front of us, not just one or two. Right? Comrades, I've answered most of the questions in the chat box. I should leave it back to the chair to conclude the session, or maybe any other agenda that might be there for the meeting. Thank you. Thank you very much once again.
Almost half an hour. So we are very formally extend vote of thanks. Comrade Krishnan, please
Yes,
extend
comrade.
vote of thanks on behalf of BEFI.
Yeah. Comrade, my video is not working. First of all, I regret very much. I could not make my video working. I don't know the technology about it. So first of all, I take apology with you all. On the outside, I feel proud and happy that my organization has given this opportunity. That also jointly, coincidentally with Professor Ramakumar, he has delivered a very enriching speech. Actually, he has given a very clarity. They cannot be vouched for nationalists. They cannot talk about nationalism. But those who are fighting to safeguard the interests of the public sector banks and public sector, they should be called the nationalists. He has given clarity on that. And he has shared much of his knowledge from the armory of his knowledge. He has shared many things that will go for that will come in handy for the fighters for safeguarding the interests of the public sector banks. And that way, I thank him profusely for. And another thing I have to mention that in this era of intolerance, with all tolerance, he has replied all the questions, he has given all the clarifications. That is one aspect I would like to thank him specially. Again, I salute our Pillachan that he is taking part in this seminar. His presence is very much enthusing. Along with that, I would like to share three things mainly. Today there I saw a joke cracked by our finance minister, Mrs. Nirmala Sitharaman, that through IBC Insolvency Bankruptcy Code arrangement, public sector banks have recovered around 5 lakh crore, she has told. But she has not told that through IBC, not even 40% of the outstanding on principal has been recovered. Not even 40. Forget about the MOA, Memorandum of Interest, or the interest calculated on the long NPA. All these things she has not, but she has in entirety, she has told 5 lakh crore this banking sector has recovered. If that is the case, public sector banks should have shown at least operating profit more than 4 lakh crore in single year or 2 years. That is a joke she has cracked that I have to mention it here. Secondly, you would all remember that O.V. Reddy, Venugopal Reddy, who was the governor of Reserve Bank of India, during this period, while the announcement of monetary policy, he was having tough time with the then finance minister, Mr. P. Chidambaram. P. Chidambaram was very much for reducing the rate of interest prevailing for the deposits in banking industry. But Dr. Y.V. Reddy was refusing it, and they had tough times. Subsequently, he had left he has retired from RBI as governor. That was the case. Now what is happening, it is really, having been in banking industry for this much and in the trade union movement for 3 decades or so, more than 3 decades, what is happening? Inflation is more. And the deposit interest rate for deposit less. Never it was. To my experience, if those days media was used to put it, this inflation of India is inching towards the double digit. If that is the case, at least 2 to 3% will be paid or calculated for the deposits available in banking industry. But now, as of now, 6.5% inflation is declared, but the bank interest rate is hovering around, it is only 5%. How it is happening, we are not able to understand. It is all the jaggeries of Shaktikanta Das, the governor of Reserve Bank of India. Another thing, this petrol, every year, this regime, BJP regime is making a daylight robbery to the tune of at least 3 to 3.5 lakh crore in a year, and all put together 7 years or so, they have robbed the public at least more than 22 lakh crore. But at that point of time, when petrol was high, prevailing around 75 rupees, at the international market, it was prevailing around $135 per barrel. Seeing that with that reason, the then regime, as called by Professor Ramakumar, that it is the criminality of Congress regime. That criminality of that regime was punished by removing from their this thing. That was there. Now the prevailing rate in international is around 60 to 70 dollar per barrel, but still it is more than 100 rupees per liter of petrol in India. Then we can very much assume how the more criminal the regime now we are living in, they should be removed from the power. That is a real thing. Yesterday I had an opportunity to hear the speech of Comrade Soumya Datta, the General Secretary of IBOC. In that meeting, he was telling very openly, very candidly, he was telling, UP election is coming, BJP is in power, BJP is working to come back, again continue in power. These bank employees should rally around. They should take a vow that we will not vote for BJP. That is the call given by Soumya Datta, the General Secretary of IBOC. That way, instead of the armory, this Professor Ramakumar has given the knowledge from the armory of knowledge. He has given enormous things for us to go with the campaign and other things. But one clear campaign should be taken to the bank employees that they should punish the BJP unless otherwise that is done with clarity. All our efforts, all our toil will be tested very, very badly. That is the thing with this thing. Once again, I thank my organization. I thank the Professor Ramakumar with the cherishing the good old I was sharing the dais with Professor Ramakumar on the celebration of 40th year annual celebration of the Syndicate Bank Staff Union. With this, I once again thank all the participants, all the audience. With profusely thanking, I conclude. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good presentation.
Okay, bye, sir. Good night.